Welcome back. Okay, so what we're going to focus on is creating some UVs for our track geometry. I want to show you guys how we can create UVs procedurally using our sweep node. All right, so let's jump back into Houdini and take a look. Okay, so let's take care of our UVs in here. So what we want to do is we want to come up to these guys right here. So this is where we have our final curve, and this is where we have our width line. Okay, and so I'm going to turn on my points just so I can see them. And let's talk about the general concept here. So what I'm going to do is drop down a UV texture node. This allows us to put UVs onto geometry. All right. This is currently what we're considering a curve, okay, but it is geometry inside of Houdini. It's primitive, right? So Houdini doesn't really have, well, it does, but it doesn't really have that main concept like Maya or Max does, where it's, NURBS, or it's subdivision surfaces, or it's polygons. It's kind of all the same thing at the end of the day. It's a bunch of points and primitives and vertices and stuff like that. All right, so that's what makes it so flexible. It doesn't really care. Okay, and so with this particular UV texture node, what I'm going to do is pump in the width line geometry. All right, and now if I want to go and see my UVs, okay, I'm going to hit 5 on the keyboard if I'm in my camera mode here. All right, and it's spacebar 5 if you're in some other mode. All right, so you can see that we have 2 points. It's easier to see if I turn on the point numbers. So we have these 2 points here now, and they're laid out in the 0 to 1 space. Well, what I want to do, just to make sure that my textile density stays uniform, all right, what I want to do is I want to take the what is called the arc length. So it's the actual length of this curve in 3D space. Okay, so what I want to do is in the texture type, I'm going to put it down to the arc length spline. And what that does is it gives me the length, all right? And then what we need to do is we need to come down here and we need to utilize an expression. So I'm going to start typing out arc length, okay? And let's put it in a parenthesis and then take a look at the arguments that it needs. So it needs a string. That's the node that we're going to sample the geometry from. And then it needs a float, all right? And if we come down here, we have the surface node, we have the primnum. All right, since we have this line, we just have one primitive number, okay? Let's go back to there we go. So we just have one primitive, okay? So it's going to be 0. Let's take a look at this again. And then we have the start and the end. And that's just going to be 0 to 1 because I want the length of the whole line. Okay, so let's do this. So the input geometry is going to be the geometry that we sample. So I put in a 0. The primitive is going to be 0 because we only have one. The start is going to be 0, okay? And the end is going to be 1. That'll get the full length of this curve. And we don't need the semicolon. There we go. All right, so if I hit 5 on the keyboard again, you notice that my points are now way out here. All right, so now it's actually representing the actual length of the curve, but in UV space. All righty, so let's actually put the angle to -90 for this cross section. All right, and you'll see why in here in just a bit. I'm going to wire this guy into that sweep node. And now let's just copy this because we're going to utilize the same expression. All right, and I don't want to type that again. Okay, and what I want to do is just turn off the angle. All righty, there we go. And now you'll notice that we're not actually getting any UVs. All the UVs are actually piled up on top of each other. Okay, and that is because we have a closed curve right here. We need to open this so that the UV texture node knows where the start and the end is. So to do that, I use an ends node, okay? And this allows us to unroll. That's what they refer to it as inside of Houdini. So in the U direction, so the actual length of the curve, that's the U direction. In this U direction, what I want to do is I want to unroll with new points. Ta-da! Very cool. Okay, so now we got rid of the geometry. I didn't just go into wireframe mode or anything. So now if I feed the result of this into that UV texture node and go into my UV view, you can see that we now have all the points laid out perfectly according to their 3D size and 3D space. So if I come down to this sweep node down here, all right, and we go to sweep and we say one primitive at a time, you'll notice we don't get anything. Usually that would produce UVs for us. Well, what we need to do is we need to set both of these to work with the point class. So I'm going to set it to points. And look at that, automatic UVs. So cool, super cool. And if I were to ever actually change any of these values right here, so let's say I go and let's go back up here to the top and I change the track width, the UVs go with it too. So we're constantly adjusting our UVs. Okay, so let's switch back to the perspective view, and you'll notice that we're getting a weird error right here where these two guys aren't lining up perfectly. And that's because we unrolled the curve. So you're going to see that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys how to fix that when we get into a little bit more of the advanced side of our track creation when we're creating our own directions or our vector directions for our track itself. Okay, we need a little bit more training before we get into fixing this stuff up right here. So what I want to do now is go through and show you guys how we could actually bundle this up into a utility type of HDA, okay? Because we're going to be doing that a lot. We're going to be doing this texturing thing right here a lot. So what I want to do is I want to select both these nodes here, and I want to hit Shift-C on the keyboard. Or what that does is it creates a subnet for me. So I'm going to actually just cut that wire holding the Y key and just clicking and dragging. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this the IP sweep curve helper, something like that. All right, what we can do is we can create these little utility tools to help us automate certain tasks. But you'll notice that we only have one output coming out. So what I'm going to do is close out the lecture there. And in the next lecture, we're going to work on creating this new HDA that really is just for helping us do repetitive tasks inside of Houdini. Okay, so let's get on to that.